Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. I'm glad to have all the members of this class as well as visitors. I'd like to begin, first of all, by thanking Professor Ida Fadzilla for her lecture last week. I think she did an outstanding job of introducing key concepts and themes that are related to our lecture series, and I think taken together with Dean Vile's presentation earlier, we have a very strong foundation for the topic of this series, and no doubt many of the things that you were introduced to and the things that you learned from those two lectures you'll be able to apply to the lectures that we have coming up. So thank you, Dr. Fadzilla. Okay, and I have an announcement as well. You've probably seen the posters around our building and around campus, but we have a special MT Engage Week event co-sponsored by MT Engage and the University Honors College that will be following our class in this room today from 4:15 to 5:15. And the event is this: we are having a guest lecture by Dr. Timothy S. Hubner, who is the Sternberg Professor of History at Rhodes College. He's going to be giving a talk on Black constitutionalism, the Civil War, and the foundations of American citizenship. And this is a copy of his book. So this is an event that if you have any interest at all, I would encourage you to attend. It does follow this class immediately, and then after that lecture, we're going to have a reception in our building here. So all of you who are able to attend, I encourage you to come. At this time, I'd like to welcome our speaker for today's lecture series. Robert F. Barsky is Professor of English and French Literatures and Professor of Law at Vanderbilt University, where he also holds appointments in Jewish Studies, European Studies, and American Studies. His work is deeply interdisciplinary, relating to 19th and 20th century English and French literature, literary theory, immigration, the milieu of Noam Chomsky, the law and literature overlap, and the Americas. Born and raised in Montreal, Professor Barsky attended Brandeis University before pursuing graduate work at McGill. He was professeur sous octroi for the Institut National de Recherche Scientifique, or the INRS, before taking up a postdoc at l'Université Libre de Bruxelles. He has taught at the University of Western Ontario, l'Université du Québec à Montréal, and in 2002 was named the Canadian Bicentennial Visiting Professor at Yale. Professor Barsky is the author or editor of numerous books on such subjects as narrative and law, radical theory and practice, discourse and literary theory, and translation. His most recent book is Undocumented Immigrants in an Era of Arbitrary Law: The Flight and Plight of People Deemed Illegal. And this is his book, recently published. And just now, hot off the press, his first novel has been published, and it's called Hatched. So if you look up Hatched, you'll find notices of it. Professor Barsky recently completed a visiting professorship at the Law School of VU Amsterdam under the auspices of the Dutch Royal Society. He is also the director of the W.T. Bandy Center for Baudelaire and Modern French Studies, which is where I first met him as a Bandy Fellow, and the founding director of Quebec and Canadian Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Barsky to MTSU.
All right, well, it's a great honor to be here with you all. Thank you. Thank you to Deans Vile and Phillips for having me. My wife teaches in the dance department here, so this is a territory that I visit often, but it's a great joy to be with you in the Honors College. It's an honor to be with you here in the Honors College. and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I wanted to propose some hypotheses with which I'm hoping that many of you will disagree, maybe vehemently disagree, and I am doing so purposely. If I'm going to come all the way over here, I want to be valuable for the discussion, the exchange. So there may be some things that you've not heard before, positions that have not been for you familiar, and I encourage you to engage me in the debate subsequently to challenge the positions that I'm going to put forward, because they're far from obvious. I want to also give you an overview quickly of how it is that I landed up in this area of work, because it'll help you understand perhaps the perspective from which I come. I first started as a PhD student at McGill University. I, like all of you, perhaps, was in need of a summer job, and I managed to find one as a typist. This is not a skill that exists anymore. You all type, you come out of the womb typing, and apparently you've been practicing in there, so that's great. But we used to actually have this, I took a class in grade 8 on typing that I was so bad at that I had to wear a board so I wouldn't look at the keys when I was doing it. But for some reason unknown to me, I became relatively proficient. And while I was planning on writing my PhD about Dostoevsky, and I had finished a master's thesis about Lord Byron, I got a job typing. And I went to a shopping center where the offices were located on the second floor. I was hooked up to something you've never heard of, so I'll explain it to you. It's a computer. I had never seen one. I had never worked on one before. Anyhow, I was hooked up to this thing and told to type whatever I heard. And they put a transcription machine, the headphones for a transcription machine into my ears, and I was simply told to type each word that I heard. And each word that I heard began with the statement that this is a hearing pursuant to Section 75(1) of the Canada Immigration Act. So what it was, unbeknownst to me, I had had no warning, no introduction, no nothing to this job. I was typing up the justification that people were offering to the Canadian government in order to be admitted as what is called convention refugees into the country of Canada. So not knowing anything about this, I simply typed and listened. The stories that are told in convention refugee hearings are ostensibly arguments as to why the decision to come to Canada was a legitimate one, and why it is that Canada should accept the person speaking as a convention refugee. The upshot of this, and I'll tell you what a convention refugee is in a second, but the upshot of this is that the justifications tend to be arguments proving that the person was persecuted. If you have read the newspapers about Syria, for example, the persecution can be very violent and can be very terrifying. So the stories that I landed up typing were primarily stories of people fleeing conflict or war, or people who were imprisoned on account of their opinions or their race or their religion. And in prison, a lot of them were tortured. So my job, for 10 to 12 hours a day, was listening to stories of people being tortured. And the job of the person who was doing the interviewing of the person was to ensure that the story was adequately told, and therefore to ask a lot of questions. So as a consequence, when somebody would say, I was arrested because I was part of the so-and-so tribe, or because I was on the opposite end of the political spectrum, I was arrested and I was repeatedly raped in prison, the next question would be, by whom, how many times, how long did it last, and so forth and so on. If there was a question of the person, there was one story that I remember of the hundreds particularly, which was the person was injected with motor oil into his joints. So they were injected into his knees and elbows and shoulders and so forth, because if you have motor oil injected in there, eventually you will lose the ability to move. So it's a form of torture. So if you don't speak in the first instance, then they go to the next elbow and so forth. And after the person had revealed this, the next question was, would you mind removing your shirt? So, and I'm not seeing anything, I'm only hearing things, and it's from cassettes. So the person would remove the shirt, and then there would be a doctor's certificate shown that would say the scars on the elbow and shoulders are consistent with the infusion of a foreign substance, possibly motor oil. So the doctor would have examined the refugee and said, this is probably what happened. So, and again, I'll come back to why that's an important detail. In any event, I would spend days, day in, day out doing this. And eventually they asked us to move to our homes to do it. So I actually bought my first computer on this account and bought a transcription machine. And we began to do it 24 hours a day in my apartment. We did this for about 3 months. And so we had a plethora of work, and we were quite literally receiving cassette tapes in the morning, about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, delivered right outside my apartment. We'd pick them up and we would turn them into pieces of paper. But what we're actually doing is we're taking people's stories and we're turning them into legal discourse, legal narrative. So this is what happened to me. This is my body. This is what happened to my body. I'm now going to justify my being here, claiming convention refugee status, with this legal document. And my job was, I was a kind of intermediary in the process. I was the person who, in a sense, turned the language, the oral language, into text, into written text. And strangely enough, I was paid by the page, which has other consequences. If there's any detail of this you're interested in, I'm happy to elaborate on it. So we'd get these cassettes in the morning, hand over papers in the evening, and that was what we did 24 hours a day. It so happens that at that moment, the Canadian government was proposing to change immigration laws in Canada and to limit the flow of refugees into the country. And the claim was that 95% of the people who were claiming refugee status in Canada were lying, that they were false refugees and they were just doing something called queue jumping. I knew better because I had been on the, as it were, front lines of actually listening to these stories and to the justification that they gave for their flight. And I became committed to telling the story of what was actually going on to a broader public. So I eventually wrote a 150-page manifesto. I gave it to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, which is like your NPR, and it became an international news story. First of all, my claim that, in fact, most of these people deserve protection. And second of all, there was this question of how bright it was to take cassettes, which had extremely sensitive information on them, and to just toss them into people's gardens for them to pick up the next morning and to transcribe them. So there was this very big question about security, which of course was one of the things that the press latched onto. When I did this, it led to both international news story, but also the risk that I was going to get into a heck of a lot of trouble, as you might imagine. And after my arrest, was told that this may or may not turn into something like a prolonged prison sentence for my actions. I strongly believed in what I was doing. I felt that I was telling the truth, and I was speaking about an issue that people knew very little about. And I was perfectly cognizant of the risks that I was running in doing so, but I also, I suppose, believed that the truth would somehow overpower whatever was against me. And as it turned out, that is what happened. The company that I was working for that was doing the transcriptions was actually private. And it turned out that they were engaged in illegal activities of selling these transcriptions, which was problematic, as you can imagine. But also it turned out that they didn't have a case against me. I really hadn't done anything, partly because I had never signed anything that I would do or not do with these transcriptions. So in a wonderful institution like the university, and this is why you're very lucky to be here, you can then sit down with your committee and say, I have to write an honors project, I have an interesting subject. In my case, I want to write a PhD, I have an interesting subject, and the subject is convention refugee hearings. But it was in a literary realm. And what's interesting about it is that it's a very similar process to what you would get if you're creating a character in a novel. So that you're inventing, these people who were arguing their cases were coming in unknown to, they were strangers to the Canadian system. They were then telling a story, and with that story, hoping to get convention refugee status. Convention refugee status is a status that flows from a convention that was signed in Geneva in 1951 and then changed in 1967. And what it allows people to do is to cross international borders if they are being persecuted on the basis of race, religion, nationality, affiliation with a particular group, or a political opinion. If you have one of those 5 categories that apply to you, and you're being persecuted on one of those accounts, you have the internationally ensconced right to cross a border and to claim what is called refugee status. And every country, more or less, in the world is signatory to that. Therefore, when the Syrian refugees, for example, apply to come to the US, they do so legally. It is not charity, it is law. They're applying to be what is called convention refugee, applying for what is called convention refugee status. My committee thought that this was an interesting idea, so I wrote my PhD dissertation and my first book on something called constructing a productive other. Constructing a productive other is ostensibly what happens when you first meet. So you try to convince somebody that you are who you say you are, which is what I'm doing right now. My job here is to be whoever it is that you just heard introduced, that person with all those affiliations and so forth. Just like your job when you meet somebody in a bar is to represent yourself or not accurately. You might decide that the most appropriate representation, if you're meeting somebody in a bar, is to tell the person you're an astronaut, because that's a better story than what might be in fact the case. So you construct yourself, and it's complicated, as you may know, because if the person happens to be an aeronautical engineer, they might ask you questions that are terrifying, that may call into question your ability to in fact represent yourself in that way. So you can, the question of authenticity and the ability to represent yourself adequately is a very interesting one. And it is, as I say, a literary problem as well. As Professor Phillips has just indicated, I've written a novel just now, recently. It took me 8 years. One of the hardest things about a novel is to be consistent with your different characters, people you don't know. I was a 16-year-old woman, I was a 38-year-old woman, I was a bartender, I was a cook, I was all sorts of things in this novel. I had to represent these people. I have to construct them adequately. So it's a process that is very much related to literature. We live in a relatively free society, and as a consequence of not being charged with a crime, and as a consequence of having written my PhD dissertation, my first book on this subject, I was hired by the Canadian government. So it's funny how these things can work out. And I ended up becoming a refugee specialist in Quebec for the National Institute of Scientific Research, and worked in the realm of migration studies. That became, for me, an area that was of great fascination. And in the books that I wrote about this realm, I became increasingly convinced that the criteria that was placed upon people to allow them to become convention refugees was deeply subjective and very hard to prove. So if I said to you that I am claiming refugee status in the United States because I'm persecuted in Quebec as an Anglophone, let's say, and that people are following me around, my phones are being tapped, and I can hear voices at night saying to me, you horrible Anglophone, leave the country, then that would be my claim. That would be the basis of my claim to come to the US, claim refugee status. Well, that's a difficult thing for me to prove because it goes to my state of mind. In the same way that if I claim that I'm persecuted in Ghana for being associated with a particular tribe that is not in power, and that I am being assaulted and so forth on the streets, well, Ghana is a long way away, and it's hard to prove this. So one of the questions is, how do you actually legitimize a convention refugee claim? The second question is, if you are in fact feeling that you are persecuted, isn't that enough? That became one of the questions that I started asking myself. If persecution is a legitimate international category for claiming convention refugee status, then isn't it enough for me to simply say I'm persecuted for me to get status? Why do I have to go through this rigmarole of proving, as best I can, that I am persecuted? Another example might be that I've mentioned these 5 categories. Well, there are categories that aren't there. For example, what if I can't make a living for my family in the country where I'm living because of global warming because Monsanto is selling corn cheaper than I can, making seed that I can't afford, and corn is being sold for cheaper than I can grow it. Why are those not categories for me to leave the country and claim convention refugee status? And eventually I just came to the conclusion that, wait a second, why isn't it just legitimate to be able to cross borders and live anywhere? Why don't we simply have open borders? What is holding us back from allowing the free movement of people across borders? Why do we hold on to these ideas of border patrols and border protection and so forth and so on, especially in light of the fact that most people, I don't know about you, but most people don't necessarily want to leave their countries of origin. I don't just mean the US. If you live in Argentina, the thought of living in Tennessee is probably something that's relatively far from your mind. And we see this a lot in places like Pakistan. People flee Pakistan, they come to Quebec. Have you ever been to Quebec? You know? And you're living on $800 of, they say, what they call handouts. Well, a handout of $800 when it's 40 below might pay your heating and a little bit of food, but it's a horrible life. And your life in Pakistan was probably a lot better. So this idea that you should be held back from your desire to move around became for me problematic. Secondly, it became for me problematic to consider that only some people are not allowed to move around and other people are. So for example, inside of my pocket, I have my little, I just became an American citizen, so I'm very proud of this. I have my little American citizen card, my passport, it's called a passport card. And I have a reasonably somewhat open credit card with a few dollars left on it and a driver's license. I could probably go anywhere in the world right now, probably, with the exception of a couple of places, and I'm not so sure I'd want to go there anyway. So movement across borders, for me, exists because I'm a relatively affluent person living in the US with an education and so forth and so on. So the idea that free movement shouldn't exist is in fact, what it really is saying is that free movement shouldn't exist for some people and should exist for others. You might say that there's a question of employment. Well, again, in the introduction, it was mentioned that I've worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Toulouse. I've worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Edinburgh. My wife, Marcia, taught this year in China. We work in different places of the world. We apply, and we land up working there. So again, for us, the problem of moving around is not necessarily the same as the way that it's construed. So these are some of the kinds of questions. I'm happy to return to all of them that were guiding me. I landed up working at Yale on similar issues, and then was hired to come to Vanderbilt University, which I eventually thought seemed like a really interesting idea. And I thought that I would continue to do convention refugee research. The problem was that in the South, as you know, certainly in Nashville, there were almost no convention refugees. There were some people who were admitted thanks to efforts by churches who would sponsor particular groups. But the kind of open access that people would have in Quebec to simply arrive in the airport and claim convention refugee status, which is an internationally ensconced right, and which your Supreme Court has ratified. It is the right, your right to do so. The numbers in this country are very small. There are many limitations to the people who are allowed to do these things. And strangely enough, and we could have a debate and argument about this, the first thing that they do when you claim convention refugee status in this country is they put you in jail. So having listened to people who are tortured in prisons, then coming here and claiming refugee status, and the first thing that happens to them is they're arrested and put in jail, this became another issue of very problematic. So I decided instead to work on undocumented immigrants. The reason being that the numbers were so large in this country. You have between 12 and 15 million undocumented people living in this country. So it seemed like a research project with some teeth. I spent about 8 years. And what I did for the project was I interviewed jail guards, police officers, nurses, doctors, church officials, people who work on the front lines like public defenders and lawyers, translators, to try to understand this process. So I began with the process of being a convention refugee. I wanted to understand the process of being an undocumented person. And it turns out to be very rich and complex as a process. And we can go through it very quickly and again, hopefully raise some questions. One of them is that there are two, if you've ever studied immigration stuff, you know that there are push factors and pull factors. So let's take the largest constituency of undocumented people in this country, who are Mexicans. There are push factors which push them to cross the border. Push factors might be something like curiosity. If you've ever crossed a border before, you might have done it out of curiosity. You might travel out of curiosity, as I do. It might be to learn another language, which can be very valuable, something else that I really advocate for and believe. It might be because you think you can make more money in a different place than where you are at that time, and therefore there might be economic reasons. It might be because your family's destitute, bless you. I use the example of Monsanto seeds and corn. A lot of Mexican families have suffered enormously and inordinately because of the Monsanto seed business. So it's become, the family plot that used to grow corn sufficient for the village is now insufficient, so people are finding themselves unable to support themselves. So that becomes a push factor also, and you think, well, where am I going to go, right? Another push factor might be machismo, which might guide some of us. It's cool. It's cool to cross the border and work. It's cool to take risks, especially for young men. You want to prove to your mother and to your girlfriend that you are tough and you can do this and so forth. That might be another push factor. Then there are pull factors. Pull factors are, for example, because you have a lot of relatives living in the US, that it's possible to work here. Lots of people do. You know that if you have a child born in the US, that child is an American citizen. That might be another lure. You know that your skills are valued in this country. So this combination of push and pull factors might bring you to cross the border. Well, as it turns out, if you cross the border legally, that is to say, if you enter in the front door, you are going to be turned away with almost certainty. Whereas there is the possibility of evading the border guards and coming around and joining the large community of people who are already here. So these are what people call illegal people, which is, of course, a complete misnomer. There's no such thing as an illegal person. But they're undocumented. Either they're undocumented because they crossed the border without the proper documents, or they crossed the border temporarily and they stayed. I could probably confess to you, but I won't, especially not with a camera, that us Canadians sometimes dream of working in the US because it's warmer. And some people, I can't imagine who, might go to a place like Cape Cod or Orlando or some wonderful place and work as a dishwasher illegally. You can imagine that person. In any event, so these things do happen. So you now have a situation in which 12 to 15 million people meet that category. They come from all over the place, but in this country it's primarily Guatemala and Mexico. And I interviewed them, and it turns out to be a much more interesting and complex problem than I could possibly have imagined. One of them, for a multiplicity of reasons. Let's begin with the flow of labor, which we keep mentioning. It is the case that a lot of the labor that's done worldwide is either seasonal or cyclical. So it's seasonal because there are crops, or cyclical because they're building buildings in cities that are more successful at some moment or another than others. So let's take, for example, a town not too far from here. You may have heard of it, Nashville, or another town not too far from here, Murfreesboro. These are towns that are undergoing significant economic booms at the moment. And it may be the case that the domestic labor force needed to do things like paint and build and so forth and so on is not present. So this is a very common occurrence in labor economics. This is a perfectly known phenomenon. And as a consequence, we sign agreements that we really enjoy and we love and we support called free trade agreements. There's a free trade agreement that governs the relationship between my country, I'm not going to call it my former country, not like a divorce, I'm not paying alimony to Canada. My country, Canada, my other country, the US, and Mexico, called NAFTA. And this country allows for the free flow of goods across borders and theoretically should allow for the free flow of workers across borders with exactly this assumption. And it is the case that sometimes working in Canada offers more opportunity, sometimes working in the US offers more opportunity, sometimes working in Mexico. So what people envisioned when this was signed was that there would be a relatively mobile workforce they would move to where the work is. But remember, if you connect this to what I was doing in the convention refugee realm, you also consider the fact that if you happen to be, say, from Murfreesboro, and you have friends here and girlfriends and boyfriends and lovers and dreams and hopes and friends and mothers and fathers and so forth and so on, you might want to go and live in Mexico for a while. And of course, we always forget this side of the coin, right? We always forget that it's not just them coming over here, it's us going over there. And if you've ever been to places like Cozumel or the Yucatan Peninsula, you know how beautiful Mexico is. Like beautiful, amazing. So what fun that would be for you to go down there, do a little work, stay for a while, and then after a while you get lonely, or you want to come back to your girlfriend, or you want to go back to MTSU because you heard there's an honors college and it's awesome, and you can work with Deans Weil and Phillips. You're like, oh my goodness, I'd do anything to do that. So you decide to do that, you come back. And that's kind of in the natural course of things. So there's a flow across, and in these flows, you meet the needs of the domestic needs for employment, and you also meet the kind of logic that exists where people simply wish to move around like you do. It's enjoyable, it's fun, and it is not enjoyable to go somewhere. I don't know if you ever traveled somewhere and you didn't have, say, well, it actually doesn't matter in the rest of the world, it only matters here, but if you don't have, for example, health insurance, you fall off your bicycle in France, luckily in France they will take care of you and it doesn't cost you anything. It's like, I keep talking about utopia, we can talk about that later. Here you try to limp back to France, if you can, to get treated by a better medical system, but anyhow, that's another matter. So you're thinking that what I'm talking about here sounds utopian. Open borders, if you feel like you've been persecuted by your country, let's say Syria, or let's say your country's been destroyed like Afghanistan, or Eritrea, or South Sudan, and you simply leave, you have the right to leave. It's it's an internationally ensconced right, which happens to be in the 1948 convention, by the way. You leave, and wherever you go, you have rights. That is, say, the right to work, the right to health care, and so forth and so on. It sounds utopian to you. Maybe it sounds horrifying to you. I'm not sure, we'll find out. But it's not, in fact. It's not, because we have an example in a place that's not that different from here, which is Europe. For those of you who've been to Europe, I don't know if you've studied World War II, how much time you spent doing so, but try to imagine. Think about what happened during World War II. Think of how much the French must have hated the Nazis. And we'll just give you a second on that one. A lot. Think of how inconceivable in 1943 it would be for somebody to say, someday we're going to welcome Germans into our country to work legally without border patrol. In 1943, this would seem, as your country is being blown up, inconceivable. Well, now, today, if you're a French citizen, you can go and work legally in Germany because it's part of the EU. Just as you can go and work in Spain, or just as the Spanish can go and work in Germany or whatever else. And in fact, it fulfills what it is that I've been describing, which is relatively free flow across borders for reasons including girlfriends or wives or children or desires or work or whatever else, and then going back when you wish to go back. And if you visited France lately, or Germany or Sweden, you notice that those countries are not completely filled with Spanish people. There are Spanish visitors, like there are visitors everywhere else, but not every single person in Spain has moved to Sweden. I don't know if you've noticed that. In the same way that France still has a lot of French people in it, even though they can move around. For natural, I don't know if you've had French food, but it's kind of obvious as to why they're still there. But we could have a talk about Germany, but anyway, this is not a discussion. But the point is that people are attached to their homes. And when you allow for free movement of people, you don't get this so-called wave of people invading and so forth. So I haven't come to the fun question that you're all dying to ask me. Well, what about law enforcement? I know that you're... It turns out that law enforcement is a heck of a lot easier with open borders than it is when you have people climbing fences, swimming through the seas, and crossing deserts. Because if people are entering legally and they're crossing the border, then they're proclaiming their presence because they're allowed to be there. They're claiming social services because they're allowed to have them. And they are subjected to ordinary law enforcement. Law enforcement likes to know who's around at any given time. Likes to know, and likes to know even more importantly, that if you're from Sweden and you're living here illegally, that you're not absolutely terrified that she's going to denounce you. So not being so terrified means that you might, if you hear her crying late at night or screaming, that you might pick up the phone and call 911 and say, my neighbor is in distress, can you please come and help her? If you are living in fear that you will be deported if you're caught here, you will leave her cry with all of the risk that that entails. So law enforcement, as it turns out, is far more difficult in a situation in which you have people living in the so-called shadows. So my argument, and I want to leave lots of time for questions here, my argument is that, in fact, the principal instances in your own society advocate for this, the elimination of this crazy category of illegals. That the idea of building a wall is not only stupid, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous for your country. It's dangerous for your neighborhood. It's dangerous in terms of law enforcement. And it's dangerous in terms of the future of this country. It's dangerous because you will have people climbing that wall. That is the nature of it. You will have people who will feel like second or third class citizens. That is the nature of it. And if you continue to call people bad or dangerous or terrorists or whatever else because they come from another country, that is also dangerous. It puts people's lives at risk. This country is composed of a plethora of peoples from around the world, and it is embracing that openness that in fact is, as any police officer or these poor people working in these prisons will tell you, is a far better solution than demonizing them. So law enforcement is easier. You can actually track the bad guys. I happen to believe that there aren't that many of them. Statistically, the numbers are not that gigantic. It is not the case that everybody from Mexico is dangerous. It's in fact the opposite, the case, that we are far more dangerous to each other than Mexicans are to us. So let law enforcement do its job by tracking the people, as they do in Europe, who cross borders and who are risks to the society, by allowing civil society to be open in the ways that I'm advocating for. Finally, I started with the realm of literature. I'll end with it. It turns out I happen to teach in multiple disciplines and domains, which hopefully sound now somewhat more connected. I teach in the realm of censored literature also. It's very interesting to read literature that is deemed to be dangerous for your society, and to consider some of the lawsuits that have been launched against people who write them. I'm sure that you've studied James Joyce. Some of you have studied D.H. Lawrence. You may have studied Bronte or Lord Byron or Shelley. All these people were subjected to trials or tribulations on account of their writings. And a lot of the ways that their writings were described are similar to the way that undocumented people are described today. That is to say, they are foreign to our land and somehow risk infecting us with some unknown disease. So it's very interesting to see this idea, because it turns out that foreignness is a category that we can talk about in a range of disciplines. And the literature and law discipline turns out to be a very interesting one. So what's the value in crossing borders, therefore? I'll come back to the biography that Dean Phillips mentioned at the beginning. I am a professor of literature and I'm a professor of law. Some of you are studying all sorts of subjects, from music to sociology to literature to dance, and you're not quite sure what you'll do. But being open to crossing the borders of the mind and coming away from your own discipline, to cast your eye on different disciplines, can in many ways be reinvigorating for yourselves and can help the discipline to think differently about itself. Thank you. So since I've said nothing contentious, we're done, right? Okay. Yeah.
So we have plenty of time for questions. Please raise your hand and ask your question. Yep.
It's not a very significant question, but your first story about when you started translating,
Yep.
What years was that?
87, 88. So this is, and you mentioned translation, which I'm thrilled that you did. This was transcribing, so it's cool. But part of the process also involved translation. So it would be something like, bon, écoutez, alors il y avait un pinceau qui m'était mis dans l'oreille. There was a paintbrush that was pushed into my ear. So when you hear convention refugee stories, most of them are in a language that you don't speak. So there is this translation and makes it's very complicated. But also it means that if your translator is no good, or if your translator doesn't like you, which is possible and happens. And the contrary happens also. I can tell you a great story about that, but I'll hold on for a second. Then they might mistranslate on purpose. And it turns out in convention refugee hearings that poor translation is not grounds for an appeal. So if you find out that your translator didn't really speak the language very well or skipped a bunch of valuable information, that is not grounds for an appeal if you get kicked out. Translation is a huge issue, and it turns out to be a very important issue in the realm that I deal with. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned conventional refugees. Is
Convention.
that the same thing as a refugee? Or those
Convention refugees.
Okay, are they the same?
Yeah, well, convention refugee, well, I mean, ostensibly, yes. When you come in, a refugee is somebody who has fled persecution according to a convention refugee is somebody who has fled persecution according to one of the 5 categories. And has and it's called a speech act in language theory. If I walk up to you in an airport and you are a pilot, let's say, and I say to you, ma'am, I wish to claim convention refugee status. The moment those words leave my mouth, I become a convention refugee de facto, which means I have different rights and obligations and so forth and so on the territory of the host country. So first of all, it's a speech act in the same way that if you say I do beside some guy, he gives you a ring and so forth, and you happen to like him, it changes your status. It's a status changer. A lot of the ways that refugees are used in the press is people who are in flight. So some of them, if you're in flight, let's say because your country is underwater, or because, there could be any number of reasons why you leave your country. A lot of them could be if you're fleeing a war zone, but you might also be a perpetrator. You might be murdering people and you think, I'm going to get caught. So you flee. And you are part of that vast clump of people who are refugees. And we see this, for example, in people coming out of, say, Afghanistan. But it's not the case that all of them will become convention refugees. They need to gain that status. So it's, but it comes from this convention.
And that's granted by the United Nations?
Exactly. It comes originally from this convention that was signed in the United Nations, but it is now part of national law in almost every country in the world. So the Supreme Court has ratified the convention in this country. So it is now, there's this way that people distinguish between international law and national law and say, well, they accept refugees, but we Americans don't want them. That's illegal. That's us being not law-abiding. We have to. There's other ways in which refugees can come to countries. For example, they can be selected in refugee camps. So that's another. So there we send officials, and the U.S. in fact does mostly that, which is they go to camps and they say, we're going to take 30,000 people from this camp, and they do the arbitration over there, and then they bring them over here. So it's a very interesting. But it's the relationship between the U.S. Judicial system and the international judicial system that's quite interesting also if you end up working on this. Cool?
I guess I'll take the bait if no one else will.
Okay, thank you.
So say we have open borders, would that not lead to like a gravitation to the lowest common denominator or like a race to the bottom in terms of like global social benefits on a like global scale? Everyone will go to the area with the highest social benefits until that's such a drag on the system that like say France
Yep.
no longer is able to provide such a high level of service, so
Yep.
then they'll go to somewhere else that's providing a high level of social benefits
Yep.
until everyone's dragged down
Yep.
equally.
Beautiful. Okay, so that's a very, very important question. So let's take the current situation in Europe. And the way it's being done right now, and your characterization is not, in fact, untrue to the current situation. A lot of people, as you know, are arriving, say, on the Isle of Lesbos in Greece. And previously, they were being directed up or going up to Germany. Germany, which is both welcoming them and also has a strong system of social security and so forth and so on. And Germany has admitted over 1 million people at this point, whereas Hungary, for example, has admitted almost none. And there is the risk of it becoming a drag on the social services of the country. Well, let's take the European system as a whole. Europe is arbitrated by the European Union. And one of our rapporteur to the United Nations has argued that what the Parliament of the EU should be doing is taking everyone who is claiming convention refugee status in Greece and allocating them proportionally across Europe, depending upon the sizes of their country. So Germany, from this perspective, should have 110,000. England should have 60,000. Portugal should have 15,000, and so forth and so on, and distributing them in that way. And what you can do in those cases is entertain arguments as to why let's say you're coming from Syria, you have a grandfather who lives in Germany, so you say, I'd like to go to Germany to be with my family, and that becomes a mitigating circumstance. That would be a way to address some of the concerns from a European perspective of what you're describing. I think that's an excellent point. There's also this lowest common denominator question, which I love, also begs the question of, well, what does it mean that, say, Canada has so many more social services than the US, and what are its implications, and what are its costs, and how does it work? In this country, we tend to have debates that are relatively insular about relative cost of social services, whether or not we should provide free health care, that is to say, taxes and then it's free, which is what I'm used to, or a train from here to Nashville and from Nashville to Atlanta and so forth and so on. These are debates that we usually have relative to American circumstances, and in a lot of cases, in what you're describing, when we can open the discussion up more broadly, you might actually have a more balanced debate. So it's an excellent point, and it would be great if this type of approach were taken more globally. As for it becoming a drag, don't forget that most people have to make a living. So sure, you go and you are living on social services and so forth, but so living on social services is horrible, even in the best of circumstances. You make $800 or $900 a month in the US or in Canada, it's very difficult to live, it's very difficult to raise a family, it's much better to be employed. And furthermore, most people want to be employed. It's not the case that people just want to hang around and do nothing. It's just not, that's a characterization I think is false. So, but I love this because I think that it says we need to look at this more globally. And looking at things more globally is in fact part of what I was advocating for in terms of, say, workers flowing across borders. Excellent point.
So you don't believe an open border system would end up dragging down?
The open border system is going to take some time to iron itself out. The EU has taken some time to iron itself out, and it is the case. Let's take, again, I happen to by accident have the EU as an example for the last 25 or 30 years. And it is not the case that people have fled to France in particular because their social security system is way better than the one in Portugal. It's not true. There aren't even relatively more. There are all sorts of obstacles, language, your relations and so forth and so on, that make it such that somebody from Norway is more likely to want to go to Germany than they are to go to France, even if Germany has lower social services. People don't just chase social services. That seems to me to be untrue. So no, I don't think so. But if we have this tomorrow, all of a sudden one of the candidates, I'm trying to guess which one, stands up and says, I was just kidding. I meant open borders. Sorry, whoops. Did I say, oh, what's wrong with me? If that were to happen, then sure, there would be a lot of movement for a while, of course. But I wrote a book about this called Arguing and Justifying, which it turned out to be an interesting study because it really showed the reluctance that people have of leaving their homeland. More than anything else, that is really what it taught me. And it seems viscerally true. But excellent, excellent point. Yeah.
You seem to stress a lot in your speech the fact that convention refugees have basic. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Okay. That convention refugees have a basic human right to be able to migrate to a country or flee from a country, essentially.
Yeah, that's right.
And so from that, I sort of inferred that a lot of nations or individuals are sort of either violating or ignoring these rights. So if that's truly the case, then how can we hold these nations or individuals accountable?
Great question. I'd like to hire all of you. We spend a month every year in Switzerland, Marcia and I. I teach a course over there, part of it in Geneva, and we work a lot with the United Nations and NGOs associated with the United Nations, like Doctors Without Borders and so forth. And the way that they do this is what they call name and shame. So, for example, when they go to see the Bashir regime in Syria, they don't get the guy in a room, arrest him, and say, you've been murdering your population, and you're obviously violating international human rights law, and you're under arrest. It's naming and shaming the Syrian government so that change will occur. And this is a tough, this is something, as you can tell, that doesn't work very well. We can name and shame in the same way that I could name and shame Hungary for refusing to admit convention refugees at all. That is a violation of international law. And you hope that the news will be spread by somebody rational and law-abiding who can talk about these things, and that it'll affect the domestic population's views of these things. It is also the case sometimes that you get an election, like the current election, in which things are being said which are actual violations of international law all the time. And nobody's actually calling people on it. So it's just let go. So naming and shaming, education, people becoming aware of the relationship between international obligations and national obligations, these are all valuable. It's why you're in school. Whether or not people want to agree with that and whatever else is something else. But to know that when they step outside of the international regime that they've signed on to, they are acting illegally. So who's the illegals in this? In many cases, it's us. So it's an incredibly important problem, and it's an incredibly important point. This is going to sound a little hokey, and I apologize in advance. But after we spend the week in Geneva and we meet with United Nations, UNHCR, OIM, and so forth and so on, we then go into the Alps and we read romantic poetry. And one of the effects that it has, I think, upon students is to say, we have just heard about all of the reasons why it can't work. Right? The military's in the way, and people are violating international law and all sorts of other stuff. And now you're in the Alps, and you're looking up at the grandeur and the majesty and so forth and so on, and you're reading the works written by people who are themselves in flight, like Shelley and Byron. And you say, wow, there's actually a role for utopian thinking, for poetic thinking, so that you can get away from the kind of pragmatics of, well, it's not possible. It's not possible. You can't do that. It's not going to work. That's not going to work. I hear that, and somebody told me the other day, America's a great place. I think it's a great country. You guys are really able to do a lot of things. Somebody told me you can't have a subway in Nashville because there's stone under the ground. And he's an otherwise very rational person. But it's like, oh, I can't do that. Or, there's a highway in the way. Have you been to Switzerland? Have you seen where they build highways? Are you kidding me? So it's like this defeatist attitude that comes. So sometimes, another theme here is to say that law and literature, or law and utopia, or utopian thinking and pragmatics, they can really come together sometimes and create beautiful music.
Yeah, I know.
Mine sounds like a motorcycle, so you'll know. Sometimes my motorcycle talks to me. Yeah.
So for the economy of countries where a lot of these people are being pushed or pulled to other countries,
Yes.
How does that affect their economy? Does that improve it?
That's another gigantically important question. So let's say, let's take an extreme example, South Sudan, in which they have the government has absolutely decimated the economy, and they've also put in place something which is also illegal, which is lifelong enlistment in the military for males between the ages of 16 and 25. So it is a calamity beyond words. And many people are trying to flee South Sudan. They're going to places like Eritrea and Ethiopia, which themselves are complicated and difficult places. And as a result, the country is, as it were, emptying out in some degree. The economy is getting worse because the people who are able to flee, remember that fleeing is very difficult. You got to be strong. The people who are fleeing are the workforce who you need to keep on the ground. So in the long term, I think you could probably argue that deleterious economic decisions that are devastating a state or a nation will eventually lead to uprisings that will have people right the boat again. Now, history is not on my side on this. North Korea, for example, is a terrible example. But let's say in this country, if a law is passed in a state that turns out to be, that eliminates gay rights or eliminates the rights of foreigners or whatever else it is the case that a lot of people just boycott the place, and eventually the economy goes down. People say, this is outrageous. This state is being destroyed by an ideological decision that's very harmful. We need to right the boat again. So you could say that, in the longer term, that the economics can in fact play in favor. And I should say in this regard also, you might say, well, who in the world, other than this Canadian guy in front of us, I'm not Canadian anymore. Okay, just make that clear. Ever claims this? Well, I'll tell you who would claim it. They won't tell you. But you know who's in favor of this is all, I don't know, I think from knowing Marcia, I think a lot of you work. Almost every corporation you work for is in favor of open borders. They don't stand up and announce it. But let's just take the obvious ones. What do you think UPS thinks of borders? Right? That's just an obvious one. I go to the post office. I can't believe how much effort it takes me to send shit to Canada. Like, are you kidding me? This is outrageous. Anyhow. But Walmart, McDonald's and so forth, they hate borders. They absolutely, they won't stand up and say, if Trump comes to power, we're moving. That'd be funny, wouldn't it? No more McDonald's for any of you, that's it. But they think it. They think it for obvious reasons. Having trucks sitting there idling at borders. I don't know if you've ever crossed into Canada or from Canada to the US. I don't know how different these countries are in terms of whether we're much more dangerous than you guys. I'm not convinced in any event. But to see a 4-hour hold up at the border while somebody asks all these silly questions it's crazy. It is very, very. So I have strange bedfellows, which are president of Walmart and so forth and so on. They totally agree with me. And it was the case that the Wall Street Journal was totally on board too until Murdoch bought the paper, and that became much more ideological. It's not as fun to read. Yes.
Final question.
I'm sorry.
Too much. A lot of pressure.
Yeah.
So, looking back, and I didn't get as much reading down on the subject as I would have liked, but for the Brexit, I know a lot of the rhetoric was centered around keeping control of the country and the economy within England, at least as a lot of the politicians were putting it in, the issue of migrant workers from other parts of Europe actually being in the country seemed to be kind of secondary. And given the political justifications of states like in the modern era, particularly that the nation is the locus of power, and people want to keep synonymity between the population and the state, in that we belong to this nation and we have legitimate claims, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And the tendency of bureaucracies to be self-serving, self-preserving, and the natural and necessary succession of power to an international organization that I think we would have if we had open borders, just like the EU is an international organization. How much of an impediment would that be, practically speaking, that people, both populations and bureaucracies, would be hesitant to give up power, even if it was economically beneficial?
Of course. Okay. Let me take your question also.
I was going to say, how do you put in the context or the boundaries or dimensions of the word space as to say how much space we have for people to come into this country if we have undocumented people that are not accounted for in our census and our areas? How do we not know that if we're just claiming to open the borders, those spaces aren't already full or filled? And we can't even accept more people. Those people would just be able to be citizens at that time.
Okay, beautiful. All right, so let me begin with yours. In a sense, your question is exactly the reason why you'd want to do it. see, the claim in Brexit was that the decisions were being made in Brussels for England. So their claim was that they had lost control over their immigration policy because it was being dictated to them by Brussels. In this case, you have no control. The United States has no control in the cases of undocumented people who come over, none. And you would have complete control if people came in with rights. Because then you could decide on, for example, you know the numbers, you know where they're living, you know the benefits that are being offered and so forth and so on. In a sense, you have as little control as you could possibly have right now because of the existence of these fences. You don't know. I told you when I walked in here, there are between 12 and 15 million people who are undocumented in this country. Do you realize what I just said? There's between 12 million and 3 Nashvilles of undocumented people. We don't know. So if you want to have more control, again, because the situation is different from the Brexit situation, if you want to have more control, you would document them. In terms of space, I'd give the same answer, which is in Canada, it is to your benefit to claim convention refugee status rather than sneaking in, because you are immediately allowed to work and you're immediately allowed free medical care. It comes, anybody in Canada who has any kind of documentation is legally allowed to go to any hospital in the country and get treated for nothing. And they are legally allowed to work after 30 days staying there. So it is to their advantage to be present. It is to their advantage to show themselves. So this would be the same situation. The argument would be, sure, some people are going to continue to live covertly. You'd have to work on that. These are questions that are going to unfold over time. But in the end, people are much better off showing themselves in a situation like the one I have now, rather than cowering in the darkness and not calling the police when you're screaming late at night. Cool?
Thank you.
All right.